All right, folks, a good evening to you all. We are live with our review session here for our first quarter assessment. Just a reminder what we're going to be doing here tonight. I'm going to be reviewing the stuff that you need to know in preparation for your exam on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on whichever class period you are in. And then we'll take some of your questions. If you have some questions already, please make sure to go ahead and use the chat feature to answer or to ask said questions, and we'll be sure to answer them at a later point in time. I'm going to go through the unpacked standards that you can find in the Unit 1 folder. That's the Renaissance and Reformation folder. And then the Unit 2 folder. Standard 4 of the unpacked standards is the Age of Discovery and Expansion. And then Standard 5 is the Regional Civilization. So that's where I'm going to be going through. I'm going to go through those and we'll see what we have here. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So we started off our started off our time together this year with the idea of the Renaissance. And of course, this was a review for many of you this last couple of years. So what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance was a time period, of course, in Europe in which there was this quote unquote rebirth of classical knowledge and what we know as the birth of the modern world. Now, we want to be careful because when we say rebirth of classical knowledge, that's the classical knowledge that was missing in Europe. It wasn't like it was gone. It was just not in Europe. Europe, of course, recovering from the bubonic plague. Everyone's kind of isolated, not a lot of trade going on. As the European peoples start to open up again, we see this refocus on the classics. We see this reacquisition with the world in terms of trading, and much of that knowledge is kind of reintegrated into society, hence why it's called the rebirth. But again, it's just rebirth for Europe, not rebirth for all of humanity. The Renaissance started, of course, in Italy, specifically in some of the northern Italian city-states. Why? They were the first ones to recover from the bubonic plague, as well as they were the ones who were able to trade. So they were able to spread this information around. That spread is going to start in the Italian states and then spread into Northern Europe. Into places like Germany, France, later on England. That's going to take some time, though. It's got to get there, and it gets there through trade routes. Northern Europe, of course, is a little bit later in the process of getting ready in terms of the breaking out of the bubonic plague. So they'll be a little bit lagging behind in that regards. In terms of the works of the Renaissance, what made the Renaissance in terms of its artistic situation? Arts was the big focus of the Renaissance, specifically looking at visual arts. Two of the big contributors to the Renaissance, of course, you see there are Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. The visual arts became much more lifelike than we were used to. Middle Ages, much more kind of blocky, not as realistic in that regards, a little bit more than stick figures, some might say, where Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci really changed the tide, changed the art perspective to make it much more real-like in that regard. Michelangelo, of course, painted the Sistine Chapel. Leonardo da Vinci had the Last Supper. He also had, of course, that very famous drawing of Mona Lisa, right, in that regard. The important part here, though, folks, of the Renaissance visual arts here is you still see there's this kind of focus on religious figures. That was still a big part of the everyday life of people at this point in time. And of course, you did whatever your patrons asked you to, right? Patrons were supporters of the arts, people who paid people to do certain artistic abilities. Literature was also something that came about at this point in time. Prior to this, folks, there was really only the Bible to look at, not a lot of what we would call fiction books to look at, not a lot of things for entertainment. That's going to change because of two people. The first being Erasmus, the second being Shakespeare. Let's take a look at Shakespeare first. Shakespeare, of course, you all know from your English classes, very famous playwright, very famous sonnet writer that will later on, of course, be turned into plays, right? And they are historical, they are fictional as well. The intellectual ideas of the humanism by Erasmus. This kind of changes the way that people think about things. Remember, humanism is big at this time. What is humanism? Humanism is this focus on looking at the world from this secular point of view, looking at it from an individual portion. Instead of focusing always on religion, instead of focusing always on the religious lifestyle, if you will. There's a lot more focus on the individual achievements, the humanities. The word humanism gives us humanities. Things like studying history, things like studying English literature, or literature in this case, not quite English yet. Things like studying speech-making abilities. Those are what we call the humanities. And that's what Erasmus kind of wanted to look at studying, expanding the mind beyond just religion. And later on, we'll look at things like biology and physics and those types of things. But they get their start through this gentleman by the name of Erasmus. Erasmus wrote this book called The Praise of Folly, in which it's kind of critical of the Catholic Church at the time. And it seeks to focus attention outside of religion. Speaking of religion, that brings us to our next standard here, and that is the Reformation. Remember, folks, at this point in time, when we talk about the church, we're only talking about one church, and that is the Church of Roman Catholicism. That is the Church of Europe at this point in time. Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, to some extent, have their Eastern Orthodox. Of course, the northern parts of Africa and the Middle East had Islam. Russia, of course, had Eastern Orthodox as well. But it's the Europeans that had the idea of the Roman Catholic Church. And that was the dominant church within Europe at this point in time. Once again, remember our ice cream. Everybody was having the same ice cream, the same vanilla ice cream. And what we're going to see here is out of the Renaissance, with this kind of less focus on the religious side, more focus on the humanities side, people begin to challenge the authority of the church. And there's some religious discontent or religious unhappiness that occurs in this regard. And there's several reasons for that. The first, as we talked a lot about, was the church corruption, specifically the sales of indulgences, in which people could bribe their way into heaven, if you will. That if you committed a sin, you could pay your way out of it. Great if you're wealthy, not so great if you're a poorer farmer or middle or peasant worker. Not really all that great. So this showed that the church was corrupt, and people did not like that. The church also had a great amount of political power as well, in the sense that you had the Italian domination of the church, and that the English nobility, they didn't get to put their people in the power of the Pope. The Pope, of course, leader of the Catholic Church, is a very powerful position. And so it was always run by Italians. And the Germans and English said, hey, we're Catholic. Why don't we get some of that? So now we've offended the working class poorer people. We've offended the political elite like the nobles, and now we're going to offend the merchant class as well. And that's because the church did not like the idea of usury. Usury is when you charge excessive taxes, excessive interests on loans. Merchants loved to charge excessive interests on loans because you made money. For example, if you owed a merchant $100 and the merchant charged you 30% interest, that meant you owed the merchant not $100, but $130. The church viewed that was corrupt because you were kind of taking advantage of people and using it to line your own pockets. And the merchants are now rebelling against that idea as well. So the church has offended three main sources of power, three main segments of society in the European society: the merchants, the nobility, and the poor everyday peasant folks. And this is going to mean that everybody is upset with the church in some way, shape, or form. Martin Luther, of course, was arguably the first major one. We talked about Jan Hus, we talked about John Wycliffe, but their influence kind of wanes as there's this crackdown. Luther was the first one to kind of really survive this speaking out against the church. And it goes back to the fact that he had the support of the German nobles. Remember what we just talked about. The German nobles wanted some of their position of power. They couldn't get it. So when Luther wants to break away, they support that movement because of the fact that they might get some power out of it. So Luther founded something called the Luther tradition and the Protestant tradition. There's a couple of main features of this, not so much Lutheranism, but the idea of Protestantism. The first, the idea of salvation by faith alone. The Catholic Church said that you need to do good works as well as believe. Luther said, no, you should just be able to believe. Luther also said the Bible was the ultimate authority. That should change from the Pope. The Pope is the one who talks before God, according to Catholics, but Luther says, no, it's the Bible that's the ultimate authority. You don't need a priest. You don't need the Pope to tell you what it is. Just read the book, and it will tell you what it's all about. And of course, that all humans were equal before God. Martin Luther's two big things that he is remembered for, and that you should remember him for, of course, was that nailing of the 95 Theses, right? Luther gets to the door, nails the 95 Theses on the Catholic Church door, saying these are the problems with the church. This is what you need to do to change. And then Luther gets the first Protestant churches. It's his breakaway that leads to the first Protestant churches, specifically for this part in northern Germany at the time. Around the same time, you have John Calvin, who's, of course, the founder of Calvinism. Now, Calvin was a little bit more radical than Luther. Luther kind of wanted to change the church from within. Calvin wanted a complete breakaway, believing that the church was so corrupt, it was not feasible to collect it. It was not feasible to correct what was going on there. John Calvin's big idea, predestination. The idea that we are all predestined, that we will be, when we are born, we know if we're going upstairs, we know if we're going downstairs, heaven or HE double hockey sticks, predestination. John Calvin also believed, though, that it was important that you live a very righteous life. This is to show that your faith is being rewarded, that your faith is strong. So faith revealed by living a righteous life. If you lived a righteous life, it showed that you had faith in this idea of predestination, because why would you act badly even if you knew you were going upstairs? Finally, what was called the Protestant work ethic came about from here. John Calvin, in some of the communities that he worked with, tried to create a very biblical lifestyle, if you will. Tried to get rid of things that were not essentially in the Bible. We talked about the idea of no plays, no card playing, no drinking, no gambling. All of these types of things were living a more pure life, and that's what Calvinism wished to do. Calvinism expands the Protestant movement. Luther kind of stays in Germany, northern Germany. Calvin goes to France, Switzerland, then it will go to France, where you'll become Huguenots. We see the Calvinists become Huguenots. Then it will expand to Scotland, where it will become Presbyterians, and it'll expand to England, where we know them as Puritans. And of course, we know that some Puritans will come over to the New World in Massachusetts. But Calvinism really kind of expands the Protestant movement. So if Luther founds it, then Calvin kind of expands it. Henry VIII does something different than the other two. Henry VIII's beef with the church was not the fact that it was any religious belief that he had difference with. It was instead the authority. Remember, Henry VIII wanted his divorce from his wife, his Catholic wife. Henry VIII and his wife were both Catholic, but he wants a divorce. And the Pope does not grant him a divorce. And so he dismissed the authority of the Pope in Rome, saying that he was the true ruler of religion. So what we see here is Henry VIII creates something called the Anglican religion. And the Anglican religion is a religion primarily founded in England. It's a national church, primarily founded in England, and it is almost identical to Catholicism, except the fact that it's not the Pope that has the final say and authority. It is the king that has the final say and authority. in that regards. This causes a great problem for the Catholics that are left in England at the time, and Henry VIII will do something called appropriate the lands. Appropriate means take over or take the lands from the Catholic Church in England. So all the Catholic churches were turned into Anglican churches, and of course, you needed to believe in Roman Catholicism at the time. Now, of course, we know the story of Henry VIII and all of his wives, but we want to focus on one of Henry VIII's descendants, and that is Elizabeth. Elizabeth comes from Henry's second marriage and is an Anglican, right? Henry VIII and her mom, Anne Boleyn, are the ones who form the Anglican Church. So when Elizabeth takes over, it makes complete sense that she would formally establish the Anglican Church. Prior to Elizabeth, we had Henry VIII as Anglican. After Henry VIII, it kind of went back to this Catholicism for a little bit under Mary. Then it goes back to the Anglican Church under Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's big thing is she is going to allow tolerance. Now, what we mean by tolerance, folks, is that there's not this, what we think of as religiously tolerant society today, in which it's great if you want to be a different religion. That's awesome. That adds all sorts of different views to society. Oh no, it's the thought process that we just won't kill you, right? You can be this religion, but you're not going to have a whole lot of rights. You're not going to have a whole lot of chances to advance in society, but you just won't die. And that's the idea of the tolerance at this point in time. We'll talk more about that last bullet point in Spanish Armada next time, and colonialism and expansion at a later point in time. Just concern yourself with the establishment of the Anglican Church, and the tolerance of dissenters. All right. Obviously, people held on to their religious beliefs very, very strongly. So this meant that there were sometimes fights that happened in this society. Let's take a look at Germany. The princes in northern Germany converted to Protestantism. And they did so because, of course, they wanted to have more power than they had in the Catholic Church. The problem was some of Germany is still controlled by this group of people called the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs are a Roman Catholic Church supporter. They had what's called the Holy Roman Empire. This will lead to a devastating conflict, the 30 Years' War, between the Protestants and the Catholics. And eventually what we're going to see out of this is going to be something called the Treaty of Augsburg. We read about that in class with that fight between the two historians. The Treaty of Augsburg is all about the fact that the local people get to decide their religion. This means the Roman Catholic Church does not fully regain control of what we know as Germany today, but Lutheranism doesn't fully spread to all of Germany either. Instead, each local area is able to decide. That's called the Treaty of Augsburg. Next, we have what was going on in France. We talked about the fact that the Huguenots, French Calvinists, were in there, but that's also a Catholic monarchy that's going on there as well. The Catholics and the Huguenots were fighting. And what we see is that eventually, in order to help, there's something called the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes allows there to be some peace between the Protestants, the Huguenots, and the Catholics. Remember, religious tolerance, same thing here as is going on in England. The idea, we will just not harm you, right? We don't like the fact that you are a different religion, but we just won't harm you in that regard. Finally, we talked about a gentleman named Cardinal Richelieu, who was a Catholic supporter of the church, but interestingly enough, he doesn't support his fellow Catholics, the Habsburgs. Instead, he supports the Lutherans. Different religion. But remember, for Cardinal Richelieu, it was all about politics. And his belief was that if Germany was weak, if the Holy Roman Empire was weak, that meant France would be stronger. And that's the idea of what was happening in France. Now, the Catholics, of course, they try to reform things as well, right? They see this growing dissent going on, and they try and fix it. Dissenters prior to Luther, people like Huss and Wycliffe, were met with extreme resistance and were sometimes killed. During the Reformation, there was something called the Counter-Reformation, in which the Council of Trent was set up. The Council of Trent did a couple of things, though. It reaffirmed most church doctrine and practices, but it did allow small wins for the reformers, things like making the Bible in the vernacular and getting rid of some of the church corruptions. The Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, were also created by a gentleman by the name of Ignatius Loyola, and that was done to spread Catholic doctrine around the world. The idea, of course, that these folks were setting up schools and setting up missionaries to travel the world. That was going on there as well. Finally, you have the Inquisition, which was used to reinforce Catholic doctrine. The idea that you need to come home, and if you're not coming home, then you're going to be brought up on charges of not supporting it. Bottom line, of course, we know is that the Catholic Reformation does not succeed because once people get a taste of another religion, taste of a different ice cream, they like that. So what are some of the main results here of the Reformation as we move forward? A couple of things happen because of the Reformation. Number one, we see the growth of secularism, meaning people begin to not just lose their faith in the Catholic religion, but lose their faith in all religions. So we see growing secularism occur at this point in time. We also see a growth of individualism as well. People stop thinking in a group think, start thinking more of an individual think. And we also see religious tolerance as well. Genuine, true religious tolerance will develop over time. One of the things that gets underreported here in terms of the importance of spreading the revolution was the printing press. Johann Gutenberg was the inventor of the printing press, and prior to him, to print a book was very difficult. You needed to take your what was called woodcut, so you kind of chiseled out some letters, and then you would put your ink in, and then you would make it. It was very, very time consuming. What the printing press did is it created what was called movable type. It used metal, and you can use movable type. So you could change out. You have this one basic frame, if you will, but you can change out the letters. It made printing extremely fast. It also made printing extremely cheap as well. This then led to greater efficiency, which meant more people could read. And it also meant the ideas of Calvin and Luther were able to spread much more fast, much more quickly using this printing press than they otherwise might have. So this was a big, big thing that spread the ideas of the Reformation and the Renaissance, the printing press. So very important invention in terms of that. All right, that's your Reformation, and that's your Reformation as well as your Renaissance in that regard. Once again, if you do have any questions, go ahead and use the chat feature on the right-hand side of that. We're going to go ahead and move to the age of discovery and expansion now to see what's going on in that regard. The age of discovery is where we'll start first. That's standard 4 here. So Europeans that were discovering lands in the Western Hemisphere had certain demands. And we go back to the days of Marco Polo, and we go back to the days of these things that are demanded in Europe. What are demanded in Europe? What are some things? Gold, spices, and other natural resources are demanded in Europe. And the quest is, how can we get more of those? How can we meet this demand? Well, we have to go and get more of it, and we have to interact with more people to do that. Another thing that was just happening at this time too was the spread of the diffusion of Christianity. We talked about that just a little bit ago. The idea that the missionaries at the time were spreading Christianity. So this is another thing that people are seeking to spread their religion, to actively seek converts. Specifically, the Catholics were. Economic and political competition between European empires. People wanted the glory, right? They wanted the gold. They wanted the God, and they also wanted the glory of discovering these new lands, of being involved in other new lands, and settling these lands for their king, for their leader. So that was important at this time as well. One of the things that helps the discovery of lands as well is the improvement in navigation. This, of course, we see because of inventions like the caravel, which, of course, has larger sails. The astrolabe, which came from Muslim traders using the stars to navigate, was something that was done at this time as well. So innovations in navigational arts were huge because now you can go away from the land and you can go further from the land as well. Compass also showed you where you were going. And then finally, you saw the role of Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator, of course, was the gentleman who who hypothesized that if you could go around Africa, that would provide you a route into the Indies and into China, and you could get some more. So all these factors led people to expand outside of the Mediterranean basin that they were so stuck in for a long period of time. Who were some of these explorers? Well, the first one that really gets a big start, of course, is the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama. And we, of course, know Diaz eventually went to the Cape of Good Hope, but da Gama goes even further than the Cape of Good Hope. Da Gama got game because he went all the way to India, unbelievably enough. And so that really solidifies that route around Africa that Mr. Henry the Navigator was talking so much about. So that solidifies that route. The Spanish, on the other hand, if the Portuguese decide to go east, then the Spanish are going to decide to go west. And that is important because remember, if the earth is round, which most everyone knew at this point in time, then you could go far enough west, you'd eventually be east. Of course, we know Columbus is the first one to head in that direction. Then we have the conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, who, while looking for a way through and around, are going to conquer the civilizations. Cortez will conquer the Aztecs. Cortez conquers the Aztecs. And Francisco Pizarro conquers the Incas. Now, Pizarro starts with a P. The Incas are in Peru. So if there's a P in Pizarro, there's a P in Peru, and there's also an I in Pizarro and an I in the Inca. And that's where they went. Ferdinand Magellan gets the forever moniker that he was the very first to explore all around the globe. He circumnavigated the globe, went all the way around the world. Now, he himself didn't do that. His crew did because Magellan will die prior to it being completed. The English will also get on the exploration game. Sir Francis Drake will explore much of the west coast of South America, as well as the west coast of what would later on be the United States. And Jacques Cartier explores what we know today as the St. Lawrence River to make sure that the French are also in on the game here as well. Obviously, folks, the big thing here is that it's numerous people that are involved in it. It is not just one region, not just one empire. Numerous peoples are involved in it at this particular time. All right. So the conquistadors led to this expansion of overseas empires in Europe. But the problem is, while this was a new world to the Europeans, it was a not new world to those that already lived here. The indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere will be decimated by the arrival of the European explorers and conquistadors, partly through warfare like Cortez conquering the Aztecs and Pizarro conquering the Incas, but also because of things like disease. We used that number in class, I think, a couple of days ago, where it was 25 million was the number of people that died. 25 million was the number of people that were in North and South America prior to the arrival of the Europeans. 5 million will be around post the Europeans being there. So quite a different population spread there. Christianity, of course, diffused to Europe, or from Europe, to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And they did so in a couple of different ways. In some ways, you see the migration of colonists to new lands. This is, of course, how the Puritans from England came to Massachusetts. The Spanish, of course, brought with them their religion of Catholicism. And of course, in spots in Asia, there was missionaries as well as Africa as well. As we saw on our Africa Empires chart, there was all sorts of religions, specifically Christianity, in some parts of the interior in Africa, even with the Congo people that we looked at as well. Obviously, Catholics and Protestants carried their faith and language and culture with them to new lands, which meant that much of the old world migrated to the new world. Why did there spread religion? Well, because people took their religion with them. Why did the Spanish? Why does Latin America predominantly speak Spanish today? Of course, because the language of the Spanish when they came over was brought with them. And of course, we saw the culture there as well. There was conversions to Christianity by indigenous people. Sometimes it was genuine. Sometimes it was forced as well in that regards. The European colonial activity at this point in time really emphasized on a couple of things. Let's talk about them. The first thing we're going to see here is that there's going to be a lot of overseas territorial claims. And to do that, there is a large migration from Europe to North and South America. People moved to that area at that point in time. We talked already about the demise of the Aztec and the Inca empires. We're going to skip over that rigid class system here because we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks. So you won't need to know that for the test. We, of course, do know that the forced migration of Africans into slavery occurred. This was a part of triangle trade, which we'll get to here in just a minute. The idea of the forced movement of African peoples into slavery in the New World. And then we also looked at this just a little bit ago, that the colonies imitated the culture and social patterns of their parent country, right? Because the colonies are going to mimic or look exactly like the parent country. We saw that example of Mexico City having a cathedral that looked like it would come from Spain, because of course the Spanish were the ones who did that in that regards. All right, what was going on in the regions that we talked about? What was going on in Africa, for example? What did the Europeans have with that? Well, the Europeans primarily set up trading posts along the coast. Remember, we talked about this when we looked at our Africa civilizations chart, that there was a thriving African cultures within the continent of Africa at the time. We talked about the Ashanti, we talked about the Zulu, we talked about the Congo, we talked about Ethiopia, we talked about the Songhai. Those were all empires that were around at the time. The Europeans don't do much interaction in the interiors. They're primarily confined to the coasts, where they interact with folks that are trading along those lines. There was trade in gold, ivory as well, and also trade of enslaved peoples as well. In Asia, similar to what we saw in Africa, but instead of European countries doing the colonization in Africa, we're going to see in Asia, it's going to be primarily done by merchants and trading companies. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British are not going to go over there as a country per se, as much as they're going to go over there as companies, right? We talked about the joint stock companies. The idea that it was Walmart or Starbucks with an army, or Starbucks with a navy, for example, that settled in an area. It was not large-scale migration of countries. It was instead small groups of merchants and other trading companies that were set up, especially in areas like in India, the Indies, and China at this point in time. Columbian exchange was one of the byproducts of the Old World, New World interaction. Old World, of course, Eastern Hemisphere, New World, Western Hemisphere. So there you see some things that were brought from the Old World to the New World. Horses, cattle, and unfortunately for the indigenous peoples, smallpox, which of course is that deadly disease that we talked about. Going from the New World to the Old World, you had corn, potatoes, tobacco. Corn and potatoes are going to help the life expectancy of folks in the Old World, because these corn and potatoes are highly nutritious, highly versatile crops that are going to be grown in the Old World that will help out in terms of their health. Tobacco will be introduced to Europe as a cash crop, and that will help bring even more colonialization to utilize this cash crop in that regards. All right, what was the impact of the Columbian exchange? Well, because of this need to grow these cash crops, like, for example, tobacco, but also like rice and indigo, you're going to see the increased dependence on African slaves. That's going to ramp up the trade of enslaved peoples. Now, unlike African slavery at the time, where it was based on war or debts, slavery in the New World will be based on race, which is a very different system. And we talked about that as well, right? Europeans had African slaves had greater rights in Africa than, of course, they did in the New World. Generational in the New World, not generational in Africa. And of course, we saw the European plantation system destroy indigenous economies and damage the environment. No surprise there. Are you going to have a cheap cash crop, or are you going to have an indigenous created product. Not a hard decision. Triangle trade. We talked about this a little bit. Let's kind of go back to this as well. Triangle trade, the idea that Europe, Africa, and the Americas were interlocked, if you will, in a dependent trade system. So the Europeans, of course, would take the manufactured goods that they produced in Europe, trade it to Africa. In exchange for those manufactured goods, there would be a trade of enslaved peoples to the New World. In the New World, those enslaved peoples would be traded for raw materials. And those raw materials would go back to Europe to be turned into manufactured, and it would start all over again. So what was traded on the triangle trade? Enslaved peoples, sugar, rum, wood, all these resources that were in there. You should be able to do that. We talked about this a little bit. You saw this in the video, and we also talked about this today a little bit as well, that huge amounts of gold and silver were imported to Europe and Asia. So much so that these caused major problems of inflation back in Europe at the time, where there was just this huge quest, and everything came about finding this gold, finding this silver. I showed you that video from the Story of Us from the History Channel a couple weeks back, where the Portuguese in the Andes found a new way of a new way of getting silver out of there. Africa, of course, what did Africa import and export? Africa imported manufactured goods and also new food products, but they also exported, of course, the indigenous peoples as well as raw materials of ivory and gold in that regard. And of course, we talk about mercantilism, right, folks? Mercantilism, the idea of mercantilism, the idea that it's an economic practice by European colonial powers in an effort to become self-sufficient. The idea, export more than you import. So that way you are making the money, right? And this, of course, means colonies are set up to exist on behalf of the benefit of the mother country. And this is going to lead to the commercial revolution, time where European countries are all competing for these overseas markets, colonies, and resources that we see there. Not needing to worry too much about the commercial revolution there for that last piece of information. But of course, you should know that mercantilism did evolve and colonial economies were limited by the needs of the mother country, as we saw. All right, so that looked at the age of exploration. Moving on next to the regional civilization here, I'm going to go ahead and grab a drink of water here. But once again, make sure that you are asking questions in the chat should that be the case. Regional civilizations is next. That's standard 5. Stand by. All right, the Ottoman Empire was our first regional civilization that we talked about. The Ottoman Empire was located in what we know today as present-day Turkey or Asia Minor. And the Ottoman Empire's goal, or the Ottoman Empire, was in such a spot that it limited the European interaction with Asia, specifically along the Silk Road. So what we see here, folks, is that the Ottoman Empire kind of blocks the Silk Road route. This, of course, leads to the age of exploration, right? Because you can't go through the Ottomans because of their high taxes, because their powerful army. They can't be defeated. So instead, you're going to go around the Ottoman Empire. And that's going to help lead to the age of exploration. How big was the Ottoman Empire? It was pretty big. It expanded into Southwest Asia, Southeast Europe, went all the way up to Vienna today, we know. Went into the Balkan Peninsula, Northern Africa. It was a very large empire at the time. The Ottoman Empire had a couple of C's that we should remember. We talked about the Ottoman Empire, of course. Once they took over Constantinople, they changed it into Istanbul, right? The Ottomans conquered Constantinople. How did they do that? Well, because they had great cannons. And they did that while they drank their coffee from their ceramic mugs, as we talked about. So the Ottomans traded in coffee and ceramics to make money. And as well, of course, Ottomans had the crescent flag, as we talked about so much in that regards. The Ottomans will use Islam to unify the empire, but they were tolerant of other religions, right? They had a large empire, a lot of different languages spoken, a lot of different ethnic tribes that were there. So instead, they used Islam to unify their empire. That was one of the things that unified it. So that's what they did with it. There, of course, big ruler we talked a lot about, Suleiman. Suleiman the Magnificent was the big ruler we talked about at the time. The next empire we talked about was the Mughals. The Mughals came to us from northern India. The Mughals, of course, were different because they're in northern India, but when we think of India, we think of Hinduism. But the Mughals actually brought Islam into India. We see the influence of Islam in India with the art and architecture of the Taj Mahal, right? We saw that in that regard as well. So we see the domes, we see the minarets at the Taj Mahal. Now, the influence here, though, folks, is important because even though the Mughals are Islamic, they are not forcing the Indian peoples into that. They were also tolerant pretty much by choice, or pretty much by necessity, rather, because if they tried to exert, if you will, their influence and change India into an Islamic country, that would have upset a lot of the Hindus, of course, that were in there at the time. The Mughals interacted with the Europeans, but only on the trading posts, only on these trading outposts. The Europeans didn't really gain a strong foothold into Europe until, into India until a later point in time. So for the most part, Europeans were on the trading ports. What were the big things that the European peoples wanted, specifically the British? They wanted Indian textiles. Things like silk and the cottons that came from there were very exquisite, very high quality, and the British textiles couldn't keep up with them. So what the British textile industry wanted to do was set up a series of tariffs or taxes to make sure that the Indian textiles were kept to be a little bit more expensive than the British ones because people didn't want that in that regards. Now, because it is coastal ports, it's not one country that's interacting with the Mughals. Instead, we see the Portuguese. We also see the English and the Dutch that are competing in the Indian Ocean for coastal ports on the subcontinent of India. Also, besides those textiles and silks that we talked about, other spices and gems were important as well at that point in time. China, of course, at this point in time, China wishes to be isolationists. China evolves out, as we saw with the voyages of Zheng He, right, in that regard, or Zheng Ha at that point in time. So they've seen the world, they explored it, they explored India, they explored up into the Arabian Peninsula, parts of Africa, and they said, we're good. You can come to us. We don't need to go to you. You can come to us, was their thought process. So what happened here in China is that China began to become isolationist. They created foreign enclaves. That means foreign ports. There were small little foreign ports that they could trade with, but not all of China was open to trade. It was just small little areas that were in there as well. The imperial or ruling policy was to control foreign influence and trade and make sure that people did not interact with them too much in that regards. This led to an increased demand of Chinese goods, such as tea and porcelain in that regard. Finally, Japan is going to continue along the same route as the Chinese do, in which they want to make sure that their society remains stable. They remain inclusive as well. They are also an isolationist policy. The Chinese set up Macau as a trading port. The Japanese set up Nagasaki as a trading port. One of the differences in Japan's political stability, though, is Japan had a powerless emperor. Much like the kings in England were not as powerful at this time. Instead, it was the nobles in Europe at the time. Well, in Japan, it was the shogun that was in charge. The shogun was the military leader, kind of the warlord, if you will, of the area. And they were the ones who kind of called the shot because they were kind of important to the daimyo as well as the samurai. So the fact that Japan and China were able to resist foreign influence meant that their cultures were politically stable, economically grew, but culturally stayed very similar. Not a lot of cultural diversity in those areas at the time because of that keeping out of that area, keeping out of those areas in Asia at that point in time. All right, folks, that is essentially everything that I have for you on these unpacked standards as we go ahead and review those. So that's about 45 minutes or so on the clock here. So that is our things that I think you need to know. I'll now open it up to questions. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type those out in the chat, and I will go ahead and answer those questions. While hopefully some questions are coming in, just a couple of quick reminders. Reminder number one, that it's going to be about 40 questions on the test, followed by a free response / primary source question. So please make sure you are aware of that and ready to analyze some primary sources. Once again, it's not going to be a full-length essay, won't be a full-length DBQ by any stretch of the imagination, just going to answer some questions related to a primary source document. Questions, comments, concerns that you might have on this content? Going once. Going twice. All right. I don't see any questions coming in. So with that being said, then I will go ahead and, Catherine asks a question here. Will there be more questions on the Renaissance Reformation or on the New World exploration? I would probably think there's going to be about the same amount of questions from each section that we talked about, though I think a little bit more from the New World than would be from the Renaissance and Reformation. Specifically, the Renaissance not going to have a whole lot of questions because there's not a whole lot of content to cover in the Renaissance. So we'll probably see more questions from the New World and the Age of Exploration and the regional civilizations rather than the Renaissance, for example. Test will be about 50 points. So essentially double what your knowledge checks have been. And it'll be, 40 for the multiple choice and 10 for the free response. The live stream will be kept posted. You can access this link at any time and watch on demand anytime you feel free. As soon as I end this stream, you'll see the recording on there. All right. Any other questions? Going once. Going twice. All right, then we'll go ahead and shut this live stream down. I hope you certainly found this beneficial. Once again, you can watch it on demand anytime by going back to the link. Have a great night, everyone. Enjoy, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.